Today we're going to talk about vitamin and mineral supplementation of the ewe flock, and I'm doing this from a management approach. So there are some things I'd like to get out of the way first. These all come from things that producers have asked me. So I've been told that by a producer that they've read that sheep don't need to be supplemented with minerals and that all you university and feed company people are just trying to sell me minerals. Actually, we're trying to assure that you get the optimum efficiency and productivity out of your flock. So here's the problem. In Ohio, there are mineral deficiencies like selenium and magnesium. And if you don't have any internal parasites that harm the lining of the intestine to reduce nutrient absorption, or you feed mostly alfalfa, corn, and soybean meal, then you're probably meeting the requirements of the sheep. But if you're not feeding alfalfa, corn, and soybean meal, and if you do have parasites, and you do have selenium and magnesium deficiencies, and you're not getting at least 4/10 of a day gain out of your lambs on pasture, then maybe stick around for the talk because mineral supplementation is critical. We need to understand that at a neutral soil pH, a soil pH of 7, mineral availability is the greatest. The problem is many of our soils are acidic, and if you have a pH between 5 and 7, the absorption by the plants of things like potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and molybdenum are all low. So my first thing that I'm going to tell you is that the most important thing that you can do is take soil tests and forage tests, and to do soil amendments with lime if you have a low pH, because quite frankly, the forms of minerals that are in the plants are in the most absorbable form. So there are some other myths out there that animals are nutritionally aware, so we don't need mineral supplements. And I have been in barns where I have seen producers that have different minerals laid out in front of an animal under the idea that there is some nutritional knowledge and that their sheep or goats can tell what mineral is required. And decades of research has shown that this is just not true and a really bad idea. If anything, if an animal likes one mineral more than another, it may overconsume that mineral, thereby inhibiting the absorption of other minerals. I'll talk about that later. So I'm here to ask you, have you ever cut your mineral with salt? If you have, you're not feeding the mineral that you purchased. Have you ever claimed that deer don't need minerals and therefore sheep shouldn't? But we have to understand that deer are a browse animal. We don't measure their twinning rate, and they're able to consume a much greater variety of feeds than we give to sheep or goats that are in a pasture. If you've ever blamed a ram for not breeding your ewes, my question is, do you have a good mineral program? Have you ever switched to salt blocks because they last longer? Well, if a salt block lasts longer than a loose mineral mix, you're probably underfeeding your animals. And if you've only used white salt versus trace mineralized salt, you're allowing deficiencies to occur. So in reality, mineral supplementation is required because we want to improve the profitability of the flock. Mineral requirements also change with the stage of production that an animal is in, and weather is a stress. Things like heat, humidity, mud, wind, snow, those are stresses for an animal. The future of nutrition is really tailoring supplementation to meet requirements and not overfeeding minerals. But for now, until we reach that time, the best thing that we can do is feed a free choice loose mineral with highly available mineral components, which is what I'm going to talk a lot about. So this is what a mineral program is not. A trace mineralized salt block usually results in only about half of the needed intake. They can also result with broken teeth for older animals, and many times they contain iron oxide. The technical name for iron oxide is rust, and many minerals may be in an oxide form, which has really low absorption. I want you to understand one thing really critical. You get what you pay for with a mineral program. There are a small numbers of companies throughout the world who provide the ingredients to feed companies, and the most absorbable, the stuff your animal gets to use, are the highest in cost. So this is what a mineral program isn't either. This is a picture of the day that we moved mineral feeders on a grazing study. And you can see that the student placed the mineral feeder right next to the fence. Well, this is fine as long as the wind direction is blowing such that the opening to the mineral feeder is away from the fence, but not so great if it's right up against it. So let's look at some function of minerals. Energy metabolism, immune function, enzyme cofactors for things like digestive enzymes, RNA and DNA, digestion, blood clotting, bone formation, hormone synthesis for reproductive hormones. The bottom line is that minerals are probably the most overlooked and misunderstood component of a nutrition program. And it never ceases to amaze me how much people will pay for feeds such as energy and protein, and then get cheap when it comes to a bag of minerals. And yes, the minerals are more expensive on a ton basis, but there are thousands of animal days worth of feeding in a ton of mineral. So let's look at what happens if you have a trace mineral deficiency. If it is adequate, you have no problems. When you start getting into subclinical deficiencies, you end up with the reduced immunity and enzyme function. You may see a higher incidence of sickness. You also won't reach their maximum growth or fertility, and you won't have normal fertility. The problem with the subclinical area is that you may not realize that your weaning weight this year isn't going to be as big as last year because you're not weighing your animals every couple weeks. And you don't know that the animals haven't bred many times till the end of the breeding season. So subclinical is really a problem. Traditionally, we've been taught about clinical symptoms, those things that we actually see that are in the textbooks. The problem with that is that after you have a clinical symptom, the animals are often near death. And from a flock standpoint, it can take a year to recover from a mineral deficiency so bad that clinical symptoms are appearing. So let's look at the minerals, macro minerals versus trace minerals. Macro minerals are those that are required in greater than 100 parts per million of the diet, and trace minerals are required at less than 100 parts per million of the diet. Calcium and phosphorus are the two minerals required in the greatest amount. Calcium for milk production. You need to understand grains are very low in calcium. Forages are very high in calcium. Phosphorus is required for milk production, puberty, reproduction, and growth. And grains and co-products are very high in phosphorus and low in calcium. Over 99% of total body calcium and 80% of total body phosphorus is stored in the bones. And we need to think of the bones as a really highly metabolically active group of organs. The reality of it is that since bones are constantly transferring calcium and phosphorus, they're not just rigid structures that don't have a function other than holding the animal up. Other macro minerals, such as magnesium, are required in energy metabolism. And in Ohio, this is a critical deficiency because it's very low in lush spring grass, where grass tetany is a common deficiency. Also, a high rate of nitrogen and potassium fertilization can be a contributing factor because they limit magnesium absorption in forages. Salt is needed about 0.5% of the total diet. So ewes provided with salt in the loose form generally consume about 0.25 to 0.4 ounces per head per day. Potassium, it's really high in forages, it's low in grains. Too high a level of potassium is an antagonist to magnesium and can lead to grass tetany. Just as important, however, is that if we tie up the magnesium that is present, energy metabolism in the liver doesn't function well because magnesium is what's called a cofactor in energy metabolism. And we may limit the amount of growth of an animal or the rate of reproduction of an animal that requires a lot of energy due to a mineral deficiency like magnesium. Sulfur is a part of essential amino acids cysteine and methionine. However, we're more likely to have sulfur in excess than a deficiency. One common grain that has a lot of sulfur can be distillers grains. I'm very careful not to feed over 20% distillers grains in a diet, even a feedlot diet, due to the high sulfur content. So we also have in feedlots something called sulfur-induced PEM or polioencephalomalacia. It's a neurological disorder. It occurs when high sulfur levels from distillers grains are fed over a prolonged period of time. Therefore, the way to avoid this, quite frankly, is just to limit the amount of distillers grains in a diet, as I said earlier. So let's look now at the trace minerals. Cobalt, iodine, iron, manganese, selenium, zinc. They should all be part of a sound mineral supplementation program. There are regional differences. Soil and rainfall have different effects. Southeast Ohio is very deficient in selenium. And so we have to really be concerned because there is a legal limit to the amount of selenium that can be added to a mineral mix. So we have to pay close attention to the balance of trace minerals in our diets. So these are just some of the trace mineral functions of importance. Things like resistance against parasites, foot rot, resistance against eye infections, resistance against pneumonia, sperm quality, ovulation, conception, prevention of abortions, optimal growth, bone formation, muscle development. Throughout this, a lot you see selenium. You also see copper. It is not true that sheep don't have a requirement for copper. They just have a very low copper requirement. So here's one of the problems. Sulfur ties up copper. Since a sheep mineral does not contain copper, if we feed a lot of distillers grains that has a very high level of sulfur, we may tie up the copper that is available and reduce our performance or sperm quality or bone formation. I want you to see that the absorption of most minerals by the animal is very low. Calcium is absorbed to a maximum of 50%, potassium to 50%, magnesium only 15 to 30% absorbed. And when we get to the micro minerals, they're very low percentages, from 5 to 30%. So when we have this as a natural product of the animal's biology, we have to pay attention to the form of our minerals that we put in our supplements. If you look at the requirements for minerals and the toxic levels of minerals for sheep, you will see there is a huge difference between the requirement and a toxicity. So if you are feeding a well-balanced mineral, you should not run into a toxic level. And quite frankly, our biggest problem is not getting enough minerals into our sheep. So I want to talk about the copper differences between sheep and goats. In sheep, copper is toxic at 25 parts per million in the total diet, but it's required at 7 to 11 parts per million. In goats, the copper requirements are 15 parts per million in lactating goats, 20 parts per million in mature goats and bucks, and 25 parts per million in growing goats. All of the requirements for goats are higher than the maximum tolerable limit for sheep. Therefore, there is no such thing as a sheep and goat mineral. There are sheep mineral mixes and goat mineral mixes. So let's look at the factors that affect mineral absorption. The organic form or chelates are greater than the sulfates or carbonates, with the oxides being the least absorbed. When I buy a mineral mix, the only mineral that I will feed to my animals that is in the oxide form is magnesium oxide, because magnesium is partly absorbed in the rumen. It is different than other minerals, and the oxide form of magnesium does not necessarily limit its absorption. Feed levels. If we are feeding low levels of feed versus high levels of feed, we get a difference in mineral absorption. We have to be careful about interactions. High potassium reduces magnesium, high zinc reduces copper, low copper reduces iron. This is the reason that I buy my minerals from reputable companies that are well known, that have research, that have mineral programs, called the Brill program is one of them, that formulates mineral mixes that takes into account all of the interactions. Processing. Grinding increases mineral absorption because it breaks apart feed particles so that there is more exposure. And finally, we need to understand that young animals absorb minerals much better than older animals. One of the reasons many of our older animals may fail to reproduce is because as an animal ages, it gets less efficient of mineral absorption. And with the minerals that are required in reproduction, if we are feeding too low of a level of that mineral, or we are feeding minerals that are not absorbable, then those animals are not going to be able to reproduce. We can give them as much grain and as much forage as they want, but oftentimes poor reproduction in older animals comes from poor mineral absorption. So the class of sheep and their requirements on a dry matter basis. What I want you to see is that young, fast-growing lambs have the highest mineral requirements in general, followed by nursing animals, followed by animals that are in early pregnancy. So it is very much based upon the demands of the animal, whether it is putting on a lot of weight per day or whether it's nursing twins, and lactation requirements are exceptionally high. So some results of mineral deficiencies. They play a vital role in forage digestion. Mineral deficiencies can result in reduced forage intake, lower reproductive efficiency, poor disease immunity, slower daily gains, and poorer feed conversions. We need to understand that subclinical trace mineral deficiencies occur more frequently than recognized by most producers. So how do we determine if a mineral deficiency or toxicity problem exists? We look at clinical symptoms. I said this before, we look at forage analysis. One of the biggest things that producers fail to do is get their feeds analyzed and to get their soils analyzed. We can look at blood and tissue samples, and many veterinarians will come out and try to do blood samples, but they're not really that accurate. What I mean by that is the amount of, let's say, copper that is going around in the blood. Well, that doesn't indicate how much is being absorbed by the animal. That just indicates how much is flowing through the blood system. When minerals are used at a cellular level, at a tissue level, so looking at something that is just circulating is not necessarily indicative of having enough of it or a deficiency of it. So some of the classic symptoms, the clinical symptoms of mineral deficiency. If we look at milk fever caused by calcium, grass tetany caused by magnesium, goiter from iodine, or white muscle disease such as selenium, the subclinical signs we will see, however, are different than the disease states. They are lower lamb crop percentages, a reduction in feed intake, a reduction in feed efficiency, a higher pull rate with stressed ewes, lower growth rate. And let's be honest, most people don't weigh their feed on a daily basis, and they don't track the average daily gain of their animals during the growing period. So subclinical losses to profitability go undetected much of the time. So in the US, mineral deficiencies vary by region and by soil type. Intensive agricultural production has resulted in soil accumulation of some minerals like nitrogen and phosphorus, resulting in water quality issues. There are regulations that regarding production practices, incorporation of manure during applications, limitations on application rates, and I just have to say, we have to be very, very careful. I have a very good friend who raises sheep, and they are near a poultry production unit, and they used a lot of poultry litter on their forages for fertilization. Then the following year, they got a very low conception rate with their ewes. They went back in and they forgot to take into account the poultry gets supplemented with a lot of copper. And that copper that passed through the poultry into the litter was taken up by the forage. And so the reality of it is they didn't realize that the type of manure that they were applying to their fields could impact the minerals of their animals because they didn't do a forage test. They won't make that mistake again. I said this earlier, mineral availability and soil pH is the reason that soil tests are so important, because optimum uptake of minerals by forages occurs at a neutral pH. So soil mineral levels in Ohio, we are deficient in selenium and magnesium. We are high in sulfur, which inhibits copper, and these get complicated by mineral interactions. When I said earlier that I thought one of the worst things that we could do as producers is put out an entire bank of minerals and let animals choose which mineral they wanted to consume, is best exemplified by this picture. These are all of the trace mineral interactions. There is no way that I am going to be able to remember all of these. There is no way that a sheep is going to be able to tell which mineral they want more and the possible impact. And this is the reason that programs like the Brill formulation program that feed companies use are so critical, because those programs are developed so that when you're adding a level of one mineral, it lets you know whether you're creating a deficiency of another mineral. So this is the absorption coefficients of trace mineral sources. So I want you to see one thing. This shows the absorption of zinc, copper, and manganese, as well as iron. Zinc, copper, and manganese are three of the primary minerals that are looked at. In the oxide form, it has the lowest absorption. Sulfates and chlorides are about 2 to 5 times higher than the absorption for oxides. And this is the reason that if you buy a more expensive mineral, it's going to have more sulfates, more chlorides, more chelates or complexes. It's more absorbable. It's going to cost you more. This just emphasizes this for manganese and zinc very well. In the oxide form, much lower than especially the organic complexes. Now, I don't feed a lot of chelated minerals or a mineral that has a high percentage of chelates in them. They're highly absorbed, but they're only to be used during the times of absolutely highest nutrient requirements, which would be the breeding season and late gestation, early lactation. Major dietary factors that modify the efficiency of the absorption of trace minerals include interactions with other metal ions, such as zinc and copper being antagonistic. In most cases, zinc interferes with copper absorption to cause a copper deficiency. Excessive dietary iron can interfere with zinc. And under practical conditions, dietary iron content is often well in excess of iron requirements of herbivores. So the real problem is if we have an overabundance of iron, we get a deficiency of zinc in many cases. We have to look at environmental impacts. There's a special concern given to phosphate as a pollutant by regulatory agencies. And phosphorus is relatively easy to measure. It does not volatilize or leach away. Phosphate erodes with soil into waterways, posing an environmental threat. And even though we don't worry about this as much in sheep or goat production as we do in cattle production, we still have to be mindful that phosphorus is not only a mineral that we need, but in the wrong year, it can also be a pollutant. So work done with cattle showed that there is no decrease in performance of steers receiving diets containing 0.14% phosphorus compared to those containing 0.34% phosphorus. More recently, it's been shown that there is, with phosphorus excretion, it can be reduced to 20–30% by now not adding supplemental phosphorus to the diet of animals being fed a grain-based diet. So here's the reality. When we are feeding grains, such as corn that has a phosphorus content of 0.35%, or distillers grains that can be 0.7 to 0.8% phosphorus, the animal's requirement is only 0.12 to 0.14% phosphorus in the feedlot. That is different than the requirement for phosphorus in a breeding animal. So here's one thing I would really recommend. If you can find a feedlot sheep diet that does not contain added phosphorus, you will limit the chance of having urinary calculi. One of the problems that we run into is I've seen many sheep minerals that were sold for use in feedlot situations where the ammonium chloride added was very high to break up urinary calculi, but those minerals had additional phosphorus added where there's no need because an animal that's eating grain meets its phosphorus requirements in the feedlot. So let's look really quickly at water-soluble vitamins, the B vitamins. Deficiencies are not common because the rumen bacteria synthesize the B vitamins needed by the animal. Stress may reduce feed intake and result in a deficiency, but that is only when an animal is not eating. So if we have adequate feed intake, the rumen bacteria synthesize the B vitamins needed by the animal. On the other hand, let's look at fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. It's important to remember that these vitamins are delicate compounds and UV light destroys them. I show a picture down here of 3 bales of hay where they came from different sun exposures. So if I am feeding a very green leafy hay, I know that I haven't destroyed a lot of the vitamin A. But if I feed more of a blanched hay or hay that's been rained on, the vitamin A levels are much, much lower. So this is why we try to have fat-soluble vitamins in our vitamin mineral mixes. So let's manage our mineral feeder. If mineral intake is too high, move the mineral feeder further away from the water source or loafing area. If mineral intake is too low, move the mineral feeder closer to the water source and loafing areas. More importantly, know your mineral intake. Calculate the number of sheep in an area and counting lambs too, and based on a percentage of the ewes weight and multiply by the expected intake. This is really quite simple if you think about it. If I know that I'm feeding a mineral that requires 1.5 ounces a day, and I have 20 sheep in a pasture, 20 ewes, I should be getting 30 ounces of minerals into them every day. Weigh the amount that you put into your feeder and track your consumption. Minerals are expensive, so let's manage them well. Knowing what the consumption is a key part of that. Salt has a significant impact on mineral intake and is easily changed to control intake. It is the only mineral that animals will try to control intake. However, you must account for the additional salt. This gets complicated because there are mineral mixes out there that say to add salt. There are mineral mixes out there that say not to add salt. You really need to read the label on your mineral mixes. And I want you to understand one thing. If you are buying an expensive mineral that you're not supposed to add salt to, and you cut it with white salt, what you're going to find is that you are reducing the concentration of the important minerals that you're trying to get into your animal. So I am not in favor of cutting my mineral mixes with salt. Please read the bags. That's my main message here. Please read your bags. But what happens when I cut my mineral with 50-50 salt? So if I look here and I have on the left side FF sheep mineral, and I think I'm feeding 24% equivalent protein and 12.5% calcium, and I cut it 50 with salt, what I want you to see is that you reduce the guaranteed analysis, you reduce the parts per million by 50%. Don't buy a good mineral, cut it with salt, and end up with a cheap mineral that doesn't meet the animal's requirement. So I recommend that you regularly monitor mineral consumption, keeping a record of animal numbers and feeding the amounts to combat a potential mineral intake problem. Buying a weatherized mineral doesn't mean that you don't need to check it regularly for intake. The problem that I have with weatherized minerals is that they can be very good, but people get lazy. And a mineral feeder that is empty is not supplying the minerals that your animals need. So if you buy a weatherized mineral, still check it daily. Remember that when free choice minerals are available, lambs eat too. Many producers don't take this into account, and early in the season, When lambs are out there with the ewes, mineral consumption is lower because the lambs aren't eating. As the lambs grow, mineral consumption increases because the ewes are teaching them to use the feeders, the mineral feeders. Please take this into account. It doesn't mean that your sheep are over consuming it necessarily. It means that your lambs are eating too. So how much will a ewe eat in a year? Many free choice minerals and vitamin mixes are formulated for 1 to 2 ounces of daily consumption. So for this example, let's say that they're supposed to eat 1.5 ounces of a mineral per day for 365 days. Then that ewe consumes 34.2 pounds of supplement in a year. Many mineral and vitamin supplements are packaged in 50-pound bags. So a sheep mineral bag with 1.5 ounce intake contains 533 animal days. That is calculated by 50 pounds times 16 ounces per pound divided by 1.5 ounces per day. If your mineral is $35 per bag, that's only 6.5 cents per day. This is cheap compared to the lost productivity of a poor mineral program. And I think that is really key to point out. You know, what is the difference between 1 lamb versus 2 lambs? Or what's the difference between an 80% conception and a 95% conception? Those differences are in dollars. When we're looking at a mineral program, it's under 10 cents per head per day to have an exceptional mineral program. So I want you to understand that you have to read the tag. This just says free choice supplement with selenium, but look down here and it has copper at 1,000 parts per million. That would be toxic to sheep. So please be careful. When you are buying a mineral, read the tag. So all I'm showing you here is what is really in a diet or a tag. The feeding directions 2/3 of the way down this graph. Feed the sheep at the rate of 1 to 1.5 ounces per head per day. Please pay attention to this. If you look at the list of ingredients, I want you to see calcium carbonate, monocalcium phosphate, dicalcium phosphate, potassium chloride, magox. Notice that magnesium is the only mineral in something that I would formulate that is in the oxide form. I am going with carbonates and sulfates in these minerals because of the higher absorption. So some common complaints. I tried one of those fancy high-dollar minerals, but my sheep just ate too much of it. My question is, really? Is it just possible that they'd never seen a palatable mineral before and it takes a month or 2 to stabilize intake? Would you lot them if they were eating too much grass? No, but people try to limit mineral intake when they switch to a more costly, more absorbable mineral because the sheep are eating too much. That doesn't make sense. So my conclusions: mineral deficiencies may go undetected and result in decreased performance. We have to measure intake and we have to measure animal performance better than we do normally. Mineral requirements change with the animal's stage of production and environmental situations that reduce feed intake. Mineral antagonisms exist, and because they exist is the reason that I never would feed a free choice mineral grouping of individual minerals to my sheep. Mineral supplementation with organic versus inorganic sources may depend on the severity of deficiency, and it also depends on the stage of production. So as I said earlier, I don't feed chelates except during the breeding season and late gestation and early lactation. And chronic mineral deficiencies are an animal welfare issue. We owe it to these animals to provide them with a good mineral program year-round. Thank you.